we're going to be looking at the Neolithic Revolution again, because we've already seen what it was a little bit. And especially, we're going to pay attention to its effects. We know that the Neolithic Revolution made it possible for people to have a ton of food and to live in a settled place. A ton of food relative to hunter-gatherers, not like a ton of food actually, but you know, enough. And we know that that change triggered massive effects. So we're going to be looking at exactly how it is that the adoption of farming led to modern advanced civilization as we know it. I want to remind you guys too that the only way you can learn history in a way that is pleasant and it feels like watching a movie, more like memorizing stuff, is to use your imagination. Really think about what each time period would have been like. Just take a minute and have one of those shower thoughts like, whoa, man, I would never have survived. It must have been crazy. The more you do stuff like that, the more you will internalize the logic and the context of the time without even really having to make too much of an effort. So without further ado, and at this point, if anybody cannot see the slides, can you please let me know in the chat so I can copy paste them? That would be awesome. Let us start off with the do first. The do first starts with a scenario. I love scenarios. They put you in the mood and the mindset of the people that you're studying. So you are now a nomadic hunter-gatherer. That means you move around from place to place every day to get food with your small extended family. You don't have a permanent home. You only own what you can carry. And your next meal, you don't ever really know where it's coming from. You just kind of hope you can catch the animal, and eat it, and then survive to the next day. So in that mindset, explain why it would be in your best interest to treat everybody in your tribe as an equal. I will take a volunteer, or you guys can drop some thoughts in the chat, one or the other. Let's see what you got. Why is it important to treat people that you hunt and get as equals? You can also think of this in terms of like a small group of people. Like picture yourself with a few people that you know that you depend on to survive. So Isabella says, I treat everyone as an equal since there's only a limited amount of food and I don't want to fight and die, to be honest. Makes sense. Cesar adds, everyone depends on each other. So if one person refuses to cooperate, that makes things more dangerous and hard. Yeah, for everybody. And for that person too, like if I'm mean to my small tribe, the next time I get sick, do you think they're going to take care of me? I'm a liability when I'm sick. No. So point being, back in the day, before settled civilization, before it was possible to own private property, before we had government, before we had jobs or money or anything beyond like stone tools and fire and spoken language, people treated each other roughly as equals. And Isabella adds, if one person is doing something wrong, it affects everybody. Absolutely. Great. Good job. You guys got the logic of this part of history. That's historical thinking at its finest. Let's see if you can predict what happens because of like the key changes of the Neolithic Revolution. So before the Neolithic Revolution, food was hunted or gathered every day. After the Neolithic Revolution, food was farmed. What do you think changes as a result of just that one shift? Any sort of effects? Let's see some effects predicted in the chat. Isabella says people's lives got easier. That makes a lot of sense. Caesar says permanent settlements. Totally. You stay with your farmed food. It doesn't move, right? So like if you grow corn, you got to stay with the field, which is actually kind of nice. And it ties into Isabella's idea that people's lives got easier. They got more predictable. Human beings love having things predictable. It's really stressful not to know what's going to happen the next day. So that alone must have freed up some like working memory so people could think about other things. Good job. All right, let's see if you can think about another chain of effects. Before the Neolithic Revolution, during the Paleolithic, When people were hunter-gatherers, they were nomads, so they moved from place to place, no permanent settlements. If you like Metallica, you have a song stuck in your head right now, I know it. After the Neolithic Revolution, people stayed in one place and settled, except for pastoralists who moved with the grazing animals, or like the cowboys of the past. We'll talk about them in a couple of days. So then what happens? Isabella says population grows, and so does population density. That makes perfect sense. Cesar also adds the first towns formed. Yes. And death. Yes. Death changes, right? People start gathering around fields. So there are more people around the farmland. The farmland can feed more people, so more people develop. This leads to the growth of the first cities and towns, but also it leads to a situation where, as we know now very clearly, when you pack a lot of people into a small environment, it becomes a lot easier for diseases to spread. So like, oftentimes you can feed a whole community. Sometimes a whole community will get wiped out by disease. Let's see how right you guys were. I feel like you are thinking pretty historically, pretty well all by yourself. All right, there are a couple things we need to remember that we've already learned that tie into this lesson. You do not need to write this down. You just need to be like, oh yeah, I totally remember that. So first, in Unit 1, we learned about economic revolutions, which are big changes to the economy, to how we get what we need to survive and how we use scarce resources. And we learned that the Neolithic was the first one in 10,000 BC when people picked out farming. That was the huge change in how we get what we need. As a result, as we already learned, population went up and population density went up. Then yesterday, we learned that hunter-gatherers were egalitarian because it's impossible to store much property or own more than others when you're on the move, and because they depended on each other directly for survival. So with all that said, let's get into today's key points. I've got a couple of tips for you guys for taking notes that make things easier. And by easier, I mean like they organize information a little bit better. So when you're comparing and contrasting, it's really useful to make a T-chart, which means like put one thing you're comparing on one side, the other thing on the other side, and then like write information in columns so you can really easily see how they're similar and different. Today we're going to be doing that with the Paleolithic, which we learned about yesterday, and the Neolithic, which we're learning about today, the New Stone Age, if you want. It's also useful to make concept maps when you can. These things take practice. They don't come easily to many people. To some people they do, but most people you have to practice these a little bit. But the basic idea is you put a cause on the left in a box, draw an arrow to an effect, which you write on another box, and then you add how the cause led to the effect on top of the arrow in as few words as possible. So like the Neolithic Revolution led to specialization, which we're learning about today, because farming led to food surplus, which led to time for some people to learn skills instead of producing food all day. So they had special skills, and that's what specialization is. For those of you who are interested in refining your writing, the part that goes on top of the arrow is often the reasoning part that's really hard for you guys to articulate when you're writing for your responses. So we know that a cause led to effect, but how or why? So today in our notes, I've organized information as kind of a combination of both the T-chart and cause and effect with arrows, just so it all fits on one slide. But you guys can play with these tips and come up with your own if you want. On the slide, there's some picture of old notes from a student, so you can see how like you can do this with very few words and make it look really pleasant. If you're a word person like me, I have to write a lot in order to remember things. So maybe the notes on the right would be more to your style. It's much more of like an outline with like a lot of arrows for cause and effect and a diagram when they're useful. So all that said, let's go ahead and start taking notes. Please title this page The Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution. Neolithic Revolution is still in prehistory for what that's worth. So we're still talking about a time before writing was invented. The Neolithic Revolution was a change in human lifestyle made possible by the invention of agriculture, which means farming, beginning around 10,000 BC. And adopting farming changed everything. That's why we call it a revolution. We don't have like revolutions all the time, right? So today we're going to be looking at like what changed in the short term and over the long run. I recommend you guys set up your notes as a T-chart as well. On the left, you'll notice a lot of information that we learned about yesterday about the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. And today we're going to be contrasting that with the Neolithic Revolution, the New Stone Age. So I'll go row by row. As you guys have questions, please drop them in the chat too, and I will do my very best to address all of them. All right, so starting before the Neolithic Revolution, during the Paleolithic, over 50,000 years ago, all people lived as nomads. They lived as nomads. Yes, please write this down one. They lived as nomads because they had to find their food, right? So they hunted and gathered their food. After the Neolithic Revolution, people lived in permanent homes next to their farmland, which is where they got their food, farming and domestication. We call that agriculture. Please write down all of those words. The Neolithic Revolution, farming, agriculture, domestication. All four of those words need to be in your notes. Like slightly different things. The Neolithic Revolution is when we adopted farming. Farming is like planting stuff and having it grow. Domestication is taking wild animals or plants and making them nicer for humans to be around or eat. All right, now we're getting to the changes though, right? So what? As a result of this change, what else changed? Well, as it turns out, a whole lot. Back in the Paleolithic, when people were nomadic hunter-gatherers, they had to find food every day. That was the job of the day. Every day you woke up, that's what you did. You found food to survive. Because of that, there was no time to develop any sort of complex skill. You can't do it. Not only were people consumed in time with finding enough to survive, but they were always on the move. So it's really hard to like build anything complicated or complex in those circumstances. They lived in small tribes, low populations, low population densities. And as a result, one good thing, disease didn't spread super easily throughout all humanity because people lived in like little tiny clusters pretty far spread apart. Because of all that, in the Paleolithic, these nomadic hunter-gatherers and their small tribes, they were simple, right? They couldn't develop anything complex. They were primitive, if you want to call them that too, but they were egalitarian. Egalitarian means equal to one another. They treated each other as equals. There are a couple reasons for this, right? We went through a bunch of these yesterday. They didn't have very many possessions. You owned what you could carry, so everybody owned roughly the same amount of things. Everybody spent all day on survival. There was no formal form of government to exert power on anybody else. And there wasn't a huge difference in gender roles. So like men and women were treated relatively easily. And actually, well, no, I'll tell you guys about that later. Okay. Contrast that with life after farming in these permanent settlements that depended on agriculture for food. After the Neolithic Revolution, you have something called food surplus, which if you don't know what that is, please write that as well as everything highlighted in yellow down. Food surplus means a surplus of food, extra food, more food that you need to feed yourself for the day. And that changes everything. As soon as you have a surplus of food for the community, then you have a situation where not everybody has to spend their whole day farming. Instead, some people in society can develop useful skills that take time and training to master instead of farming. Like, you can learn how to make weapons, you can learn how to work metal, you could learn how to turn plants into medicines, you could develop a system of writing and trade. This is called specialization. It's the acquisition of special skills beyond farming. We still have specialists, right? I'm a specialist in history. I went to graduate school for it. Doctors are specialists in medicine. Mechanics are specialists in cars. Specialization defines life in a civilized community. And you can only have it when you have enough food so that not everybody has to spend all day getting food. So food surplus led to specialization. Huge. And because of that, trade develops. So you can trade extra food for useful things. Towns, villages, and cities get bigger and bigger with higher populations because you can support more people. And as some of you rightly predicted in the Do First, a higher population density also comes with the downside of more disease. So as we're learning, the more people you put together, the faster you're going to get disease spread. So that's like the first major chain of cause and effect, right? Farming led to food surplus, which allowed specialization, which allowed all kinds of things to develop, which is pretty good. It gets us out of the caveman stage of life, but it came with some gigantic costs. Now I'm at the very last row. The biggest contrast that we know of between civilized, settled farming life and life as nomadic hunter-gatherers is that hunter-gatherers treated each other as equals. And as soon as human beings settled down to farm, we stopped doing that. Social hierarchy and inequality developed as an effect of the Neolithic Revolution. The social hierarchy, if you don't remember the definition from a few classes ago, it's the division of society into classes based on power and wealth, with like rich people at the top and little peasants at the bottom, right? The caste system, which we learned about a few weeks ago, was an example of a social hierarchy. So as soon as you settle down into civilization and have farming and food surplus and specialization, you also immediately have that pyramid, the social hierarchy, that shows some people have more power and wealth than everybody else. There are a few reasons for that. One, with permanent settlements, people can now store property. So the idea of private property, what is versus what is yours, develops in a way that it hadn't ever developed before then. So we now have ideas of like mine versus yours. And then we also have, I can have a lot more things than you. So now I'm rich and you're poor, and that didn't exist before, but now it does. If I have more cows than you, I'm rich. You're not. Sorry. Get more cows. A second reason that inequality developed is that specialization itself causes inequality in some ways because some skills are valued more highly than others. So if I came from a family that had like extra cows, rich family now, right? I can spend my time learning how to write or how to make weapons, or I can develop my religion and become a priest, or I can, learn medicine if I wanted. Whatever passed as medicine back then, anyway. Because I have special skills that not everybody else has, I become more important to the community. I know things that not everybody else knows, and people depend on my knowing these things. So I have more power than people who don't know the things that I know. Doctor, I have more power and wealth than a peasant, because if somebody gets sick in the community, another peasant isn't going to be able to fix it. The person with specialized knowledge does. This exists today too, right? The whole reason, not the whole reason. The reason to go to college is to pursue your interests, but an economic reason to go to college is that the more special skills you gain, the more valued you still are in society, and likely the higher your paycheck will be. A third way inequality developed is that complex society requires a government. You guys know this deep down, even if you don't think you do. But as soon as you get a certain number of people around, you actually do need rules to, make them act like civilized human beings. You need somebody in the group to direct activities. Everybody can't do whatever they want. In a farming society, you needed a government to manage like complex tasks, like creating canals to water all the crops and stuff like that. So a government formed, and as soon as you have a government, you have an elite, an upper class of people who create and enforce rules, like the kings and his ministers and probably the priests. So that's another way that society became unequal. Now you have people who make rules and everybody else who follows them. And finally, something called patriarchy developed. Please write down the word patriarchy. Patriarchy is something that we still struggle to undo. Patriarchy means a society in which men treat women like property and control the power structures. This is something I've been thinking about a lot this week. I think it's like crazy, really, if you think rationally about it, that up until like very recently within my own lifetime, it was kind of normal to just like let men make all the decisions. That's weird, right? Men don't always make the best decisions. And yet, this is the society that the Neolithic Revolution created and that we've been stuck with ever since. Because of patriarchy, men began to treat women like belongings, not like equals, but like a thing that belonged to them, a possession. And women started having more children during this time because permanent homes mean you don't have to carry them everywhere with you, and food surplus means you can feed them. So women started to take on more of a gendered role than they had before, staying at home, taking care of the children, and raising them. And men began to take on more of a men in charge, like we provide for the family and tell you what to do kind of role. So before specialization, I could learn skills. Actually, I couldn't because I'm a girl. Probably a guy would have been doing all that and I would have had no power. So these are the causes and effects that make the Neolithic Revolution such a turning point in history. To recap with pictures. Permanent settlements and farming led to food surplus. Cute little puppy has. He has too much food, more food than he needs. That caused specialization because some people could spend their time doing things that had nothing to do with getting food and instead learn to make weapons or write. As soon as you get writing, history begins, by the way, so that's coming up next. But you also get social inequality, the unequal sharing of resources and social rewards. So, costs, benefits, everything advanced that we have, but also all of the unfairness. New forms of inequality developed. At the very top of the social hierarchy, we now have kings and priests, like government and religion at the very top, usually working together, with an elite, an upper class that makes laws that everybody else has to follow. We have new forms of inequality in terms of like the power that people have, right? Government and religion have a lot, regular people not so much. In terms of wealth, like the wealthy at the top, the poor people at the bottom. And in terms of skills, specialized skills, any skill that you had to like take time and training to master that wasn't farming was valued above farming. And then finally, we have patriarchy. And not to put too fine a point on it, but the picture on the right of the slide with a man standing on a woman who is a carpet is from like my mother's lifetime. It was super common until very recently, and even now, actually, for men to just tell women what to do and to treat them like possessions. And I think it's crazy. And I'm kind of ready for that part of history to go directly into the trash can, if you ask me. Okay.